Hello, this is Captain Mannering of Northumbria, or Gordon Taylor as he's better known, reading from his book Cometh the Man, Chapter 5. The voyage from Lisbon to their present position midway to Cape Town had been a carbon copy of the first stage from Newcastle to the Portuguese city. Nathaniel thought he would go mad with the tedium at times, his desire to get off the ship becoming obsessional. Davenport was equally bored. His good humour had deserted him days before, and for the first time he and the boy had squabbled over something trivial. Thankfully for them both, it had blown over almost as soon as it started. The evening was balmy. The scant breeze afforded little relief for the companions as they sat on deck before turning in. Overhead, the sky was crystalline clear. Millions of stars sparkled down, the full moon beating a shimmering pathway across the inky water. Nathaniel looked back over the stern, expecting to see a continuation of the peaceful scene. Instead, he was perturbed to make out ominous clouds chasing the vessel down from that direction. Ebenezer Smith stood next to the helmsman, a frown spreading across his handsome features as he watched the scene unfolding. Experience told him a very dangerous storm was approaching. He judged it was perhaps half an hour away, but it was closing relentlessly fast. The watch crew saw it too, sending a shudder through the most sea-hardened of them. Forks of lightning tore through the angry clouds, the intensity of the flashes staggering. Like a volley of cannon, thunder rumbled ominously across the sky. Smith barked some orders to his men and called for a muster of the whole company. The hatches were battened down, and the Lady Bambara prepared as best she could for the coming assault. Sails were struck in record time by men climbing like crazed monkeys through the rigging, although Captain Smith left some canvas in place for manoeuvring purposes. Every seaman was back on the deck in 15 minutes, stowing anything on board that could move, and fastening themselves with rope to the sturdiest parts of the ship. The first buffeting was mild enough, but presently grew steadily in force, wildly flapping canvas covering some of the secured equipment. "Captain," yelled Davenport, "is there anything we can do?" Smith was trying to do several things at once. "Gentlemen, please find some rope and lash yourselves to the ship," he advised. "I fear this will be dreadful." "Would it not be better to be below?" Ebenezer questioned Nathaniel. "Absolutely not," Smith yelled back. "Stay on deck. You do not want to be trapped below. Trust me on that." Suddenly the full force of the howling fury was upon them, the crashing of the first real wind scudding the ship over the angry sea. A truly awesome crash of thunder exploded overhead, ringing the ears. It was followed by an enormous jagged zigzag of lightning which bathed the ship in an eerie luminosity. Rolling waves of 30 feet or more started crashing over the decks, smashing timbers as they hit. Nathaniel looked toward the helmsman, lashed to the wheel, struggling to keep course, his knuckles white with the effort. With an ear-rupturing din, the stern rail shattered. A 3-foot section flew through the air and pierced the helmsman through the back. Its jagged point exited the man's chest and lodged in the spokes of the ship's wheel. His body slumped over, but stayed upright, held by the lashings to the steering device. His chin rested between the handles of the wheel, the gargoyle face staring blankly into space. 2 seamen rushed to the position and unhooked the man from the wooden circle. One of them replaced him and began fighting with it, trying to avoid the viscous blood, hands slipping constantly on the liquid. In spite of the bindings, all manner of item loosened and flew dangerously across the decks. Water kegs dashed against the rails and disappeared over the side, gone forever into the seething sea. It was a scene from hell, thought Nathaniel. The devil had visited the ship and was wreaking havoc. He believed he would die on the deck of the Lady Bambara. All he could think of as he watched the scene played out before him was Thistleborough and Sally. The 2 things he held most dear in his heart. He judged that he might never see either one again. Despite his prayers to the contrary, the storm was building to a new level of fierceness. Waves of 50 feet or more, whipped up by hurricane-force winds, battered remorselessly into the ship. His clothes were saturated from the crashing surf, as well as the ceaseless rain which had begun just after the first crack of thunder. Shivering, he cowed down to avoid further soaking. The display on deck was being played out in slow motion before Nathaniel. Men were dashed around like rag dolls, dancing to the bidding of nature. As he looked on, a wave lifted one man up, propelled him across the deck, straight into a taut rope slung across the beam of the vessel. There was a sickening crack audible over the clamour as the man's neck crashed into the strand, ripping his head back and shattering the vertebrae. He died instantly, falling back to the planking in a jumble of lifeless limbs. Captain Smith stood erect by the wheel. If he was perturbed, it didn't show in his face. Amidst the carnage around him, he directed operations with cool authority. He was bleeding profusely from a gash on his temple, caused by some flying object, and still he carried on regardless. Self-preservation was the order of the day. The men possessed supreme confidence in the master of their ship, knowing their best chance of survival lay in listening to and obeying the orders of their captain. A wave of awesome magnitude swept over the deck, caught up Nathaniel and pitched him over the side rail. He fell flailing overboard, hitting the frothy sea and disappearing below the waves, until the rope lashing arrested his descent. With no time to catch his breath, he ingested water, the prospect of drowning a real threat. Fighting for survival, he realised he didn't know in which direction the surface lay. In the black depths he had tumbled over and over until he was disorientated. Now would come death, he mused, and a curious calm descended on him. A pain shot through Nathaniel's midriff, the rope tightening around his body. He realised he was being dragged up by the lashing. Thankfully, he exited the sea and gasped a huge breath into his lungs. As the rope began to drag him back to the ship, it pummeled him into the vessel's flank, bruising him in the process. It was a small inconvenience for the gift of life. His hands fought to grasp hold on the wet planking. Inexorably, Nathaniel was hauled back to the rail, where he saw the face of Davenport, furrowed from his exertions, pulling for all he was worth to save his companion. With one huge effort, he jerked the boy aboard, the two men floundering in the cold grey water still flooding the deck. "Are you all right, Nathaniel?" croaked his friend, doubled over with exhaustion. The boy flung his arms around his saviour. "Thank you, Christian. Thank you for my life." Davenport grinned back at him. "My pleasure." He was panting hard. "Anyway, we made a pact to be together in Africa, so it wasn't practical to let you drown." It took more than 2 hours for the storm to abate. In that time, the vessel had almost floundered several times, canting at such angles that it was a miracle that she could possibly right herself, thought Nathaniel. There had been one more death aboard, the first mate who Nathaniel and Christian had met early in the voyage. The life had been crushed out of him by 2 rogue kegs, dashing him into the ship's side, pulverising the body against the wood into a bloody mass. One of his ribs had pierced his heart, and the man died without uttering a word. A valiant man, he had served many souls by his quick-thinking actions during the height of the storm. He'd be acutely missed. A number of other seamen had received injuries, some seriously, some superficial wounds. As soon as the conditions moderated, Captain Smith ordered that the men should be attended to. The overwhelmed ship's surgeon appealed to Nathaniel and Davenport for assistance, and although neither had medical experience, they pitched in as best they could. In the surgeon's dingy quarters, a man lay on the table, one of his legs crushed beyond repair. The doctor was preparing to amputate the limb, while the terrified individual swallowed huge amounts of rum. Nathaniel looked at the surgeon's sore and shuddered. He couldn't grasp the pain this man was about to feel, despite the copious levels of alcohol. The man's eyes betrayed abject fear. At a nod of the surgeon's head, Nathaniel, Davenport, and 2 of the ship's company grabbed the man, holding him in vice-like grip as the doctor approached with a knife to slice through the thigh tissue. He worked rapidly and skillfully, having performed the procedure on many naval men during his time with the senior service. As he cut through the main artery, a plume of streaming blood gushed into the air. From a nearby brazier, a seaman handed a glowing iron, and the surgeon cauterized the artery quickly to prevent more blood loss. The victim's screams were frightful. Thankfully, he passed out, and the doctor could work without the inconvenience of the jerking foam. Nathaniel gagged as the smell of the cauterization smoke rose. It was the smell of sweet pork making his stomach heave, and he vomited copiously on the deck. No one took notice. As the saw grated noisily on the bone, the casualty moaned in his unconscious state, but did not come round. The room was becoming intolerably hot, its small, cramped confines filled to capacity by the 6 men. 15 minutes later, the operation was complete. The newly sewn flesh bound and the man returned to his hammock. The next few days would determine if he survived or not. Infection was the surgeon's enemy, and he would inspect his handiwork every hour for a week, looking for the signs of tissue decay which would indicate the onset of gangrene. At first light, the crew assembled on deck, ready to witness the burial of their 3 shipmates. It was a beautiful sunrise, in marked contrast to the cataclysmic conditions of the night before. Through the night, canvas shrouds had been rapidly constructed for their bodies, which now lay on the deck. Inside the sailcloth, spare anchor chain had been placed to weigh down the covers, sufficient links to ensure a quick descent to the seabed. The crew were exhausted from their exertions, but every one of them stood ready for the service. Captain Smith looked particularly distressed. Moving to the side of the bodies, handsome looks degraded by his night's work. Holding the ship's Bible open at the relevant passages, and called the men to order. It was a moving service, thought Nathaniel, who stood at the back of the throng along with Davenport, each anxious to show camaraderie with the company and to show respect to the brave souls who had given their lives to the securing of the ship. Their efforts had been much appreciated by everyone. "We commend their souls to the deep," drawled Smith, "in the sure and certain hope of their resurrection to God's holy grace." The man's face demonstrated his despondency at the loss of his crew members. With a nod to the burial party, they lifted the shrouds onto greased planks, placing them on the ship's rail. At a given signal, the wooden boards were angled high, and the canvas body bags slipped silently over the side, hitting the calm water at the same time. For a few minutes, the ship's company milled around, lost in thought about their comrades, before moving away to take up their duties. Nathaniel moved to the captain's side. He was peering down at the sea. The loss seemed to be affecting him greatly, and for a few seconds the boy seemed to be reluctant to break into the man's reverie. "Captain," he eventually said, "may I offer you condolences on the loss of your crew? Brave men, and I'm sure they'll be sadly missed." "Thank you, Nathaniel," he retorted as Davenport came to join them. "And may I thank you both for your efforts in ministering to my crew. It was something that was beyond your duty." He seemed to be thinking about something and then went on. "Gentlemen, because of your service to the ship, I'm returning your passage money. It's little enough to do for you after your endeavours." It was a magnificent gesture, thought Nathaniel. "But, Captain, it was in our interest to save ourselves," he returned. "Nevertheless, my mind is made up," the ship's master continued. "Much of what you did was horrific, particularly in the surgeon's cabin, and you deserve some reward for that alone." Several days were spent in restoring the ship to a seaworthy state. The ship's carpenter, the busiest man aboard, repairing the wooden fabric that had been so degraded by the storm. Just as the Lady Barbara seemed to be renewed to something like its original state, Cape Town appeared before her, set out in magnificent splendour under the fierce sun. The sight of Table Mountain rising grandly from the centre of the city impressed everyone on board who had never witnessed the spectacle, including Nathaniel. To him, it looked like God had deposited the mass purposefully in the middle of the conurbation. He was amazed at the horizontal plateau, the evenness of which looked as if some giant knife had sliced the peak clean off. Golden sand stretched away across the beach in the foreground. Unique flora completed a scene of staggering loveliness. Captain Smith pointed out the Supreme Court building to the travelling companions, its impressive facade with arched windows in the upper tier and square in the lower, silhouetted against the backdrop of the mountain. It was a curious mustard colour, but complemented the buildings surrounding it perfectly. "My God," exclaimed Nathaniel, "it's so beautiful." "Yes," agreed Smith, "but like all cities the world over, it has its dark side. Still, if one remains vigilant, there's no reason to worry." Davenport gazed on the scene, equally inspired. "I've seen many sights during my army career, but nothing to rival this. Nothing even comes close." Smith wandered away from the two men into his duties, the friends remaining at the rail, drinking in the scene before their eyes. Half an hour later, the Lady Barbara was anchored offshore, gently bobbing in the swell. The longboat was launched, clattering gently against the side planking at her mooring. In their cabins, Nathaniel and Christian gathered their belongings, heading on up to the deck, presently to board the transport to shore. The sights on land only added to the men's appreciation of the city, most striking of which was the stone-walled Castle of Good Hope, along with the Lodge de Guerder Hope, built by the Freemasons 16 years earlier in 1804. From his books at home in Thistleborough Hall, Nathaniel knew that magnificent beasts roamed the dense forests of the Cape. He looked forward to seeing these animals in their natural state. Hippo, lion and elephant vied for their ascendancy in the Fynbos. Sweltering heat made Nathaniel sweat profusely. He began to feel dizzy and disorientated, and his thirst was monumental. Spotting a drinking fountain in a nearby street, he rushed over and drank deeply of the fresh, cold liquid. "I suppose we'd better find some accommodation, my friend. You're looking a bit unwell," Davenport advised, looking concerned. He guided the boy away solicitously in the direction of a nearby hotel. As they crossed the street, Nathaniel noticed inky black slaves hurrying behind their masters and mistresses. In this part of the globe, the number of blacks an individual possessed enhanced their standing. 2 was the minimum, more than 10 was a positive feather in the cap. Women twirling parasols, looking serene and cool in the blistering heat, strolled along the thoroughfare, talking between themselves of inconsequential matters. It was a scene familiar to any city in the civilized world. People going about their business, the high-born and slave alike, only their personal circumstances differed. Davenport shepherded the boy into the foyer of the Star Hotel, the dehydration in Nathaniel acute. The captain sat him in a plush lobby chair while he sought out the hotel's manager. The interior of the entrance hall was mercifully cool, but the heat exhaustion had already taken a heavy toll on the young man, who slumped over in his seated position, delirium setting in. Davenport returned, having secured rooms for themselves. His money was depleting fast. He knew that somehow they would have to find more soon. It worried him greatly, but his friend's well-being took precedence. 2 burly porters assisted him in hauling Nathaniel to bed, and there he collapsed in a fitful sleep, but only after his companion had forced as much water down his throat as he could take. That is from Cometh the Man by Gordon Taylor, available on Amazon for download only at the ridiculously small price of 99p. You can't even buy a Greggs steak bake for that. Thanks very much for listening. Hope you like it and hope you go to buy it. Thanks again.